Sometimes the quietest woman in the room is the one carrying the truth that can change everything. The skyline of Manhattan glowed like a field of quiet stars beyond the glass walls of the Hawthorne Grand Ballroom, 50 floors above Fifth Avenue, where the city lights reflected off polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers that hummed softly with electricity and wealth. The annual Hawthorne Tech Innovation Gala had drawn the most powerful names in American technology, investors in tailored suits, founders with billion-dollar ideas, journalists holding slim recorders and champagne flutes, all gathered beneath a ceiling that shimmered like winter ice. At the center of that room stood Nathan Cole, 38 years old, founder of Cole Dynamics, a tech company that had gone from a cramped Brooklyn warehouse to a $40 billion enterprise in less than a decade. Cameras loved Nathan Cole because he looked exactly like the story America liked to believe about success. Tall, composed, sharp jawline, dark suit cut perfectly across his shoulders, the kind of man who built algorithms that moved markets and never seemed to break a sweat while doing it. When he spoke at conferences, people listened. When he invested in a startup, it made headlines. When he walked into a room like this one, the energy shifted just slightly, as if gravity itself had decided to lean in his direction. Tonight was no different. Soft jazz drifted from a quartet near the stage, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood, perfume, and the citrus twist floating in expensive drinks. Nathan stood near the front of the ballroom, speaking with two venture partners about a new satellite data platform, when something small and unexpected pulled his attention sideways. Not a sound exactly, more like a change in the rhythm of the room. Across the crowd, near the far wall where the light dimmed slightly beneath a tall arrangement of white orchids, stood a woman in a simple dark dress that contrasted with the glittering gowns around her. She was not speaking to anyone. She was not trying to be seen. Her hands rested calmly in front of her, fingers laced together, posture steady, gaze lowered toward the polished floor as if she had stepped into the wrong world and preferred not to disturb it. Nathan recognized her instantly, though he had never seen her in a place like this before. Aisha Brooks, the maid who worked in his penthouse 3 mornings a week. For a moment his mind refused to place the image correctly, like a photograph that had been printed with the wrong background. In his home, she wore a neat gray uniform and moved quietly through wide sunlit rooms overlooking Central Park, tidying books, wiping glass surfaces, straightening the kind of expensive minimal furniture that always looked untouched, even when someone lived there. She rarely spoke beyond polite greetings. "Good morning, Mr. Cole. Coffee is ready. Have a nice evening." Her voice was soft but clear, and she carried herself with a calm dignity that had caught Nathan's attention the first week she started working there. She never lingered, never asked questions, never looked impressed by the view from the 72nd floor or the black grand piano near the windows. She simply did her work with a steady focus that felt almost old-fashioned in a city that thrived on noise. Yet tonight she was here in the middle of the most exclusive event in the tech world, standing quietly beneath chandeliers that cost more than most apartments in Queens. Nathan frowned slightly, the conversation beside him fading as he studied the small but undeniable detail that made the moment feel unreal. Aisha's dress, simple as it was, curved gently over a rounded belly that had not been there the last time he saw her 2 weeks ago. It was not dramatic, not the kind of thing a crowded room would immediately notice. But once his eyes caught the shape, it became impossible to ignore. The curve of new life beneath the fabric. Nathan felt something inside his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with business deals or market volatility. 6 months earlier, the city had been buried beneath the worst snowstorm of the winter, a slow, heavy storm that shut down bridges and trapped thousands of commuters across Manhattan. That night, Nathan had been working late in his penthouse reviewing a security software acquisition when the storm intensified so quickly that the entire city seemed to pause beneath it. Flights were canceled. Subways stalled. Roads turned white and silent. Aisha had been finishing her shift when the building management advised staff not to leave until conditions improved. The storm lasted longer than anyone expected, and the massive windows of the penthouse filled with swirling snow that made the skyline disappear entirely. For hours the city outside looked like a blank page. Inside the apartment the lights were warm and steady, and the quiet stretched across the rooms like a held breath. Nathan remembered offering her tea because the kitchen felt too silent otherwise. He remembered the conversation that followed. Simple things at first, where she grew up in Baltimore, how she moved to New York to help support her younger brother through college, how she preferred early mornings because the city felt calmer before traffic and ambition took over the streets. There had been nothing reckless or inappropriate about the evening, nothing that belonged in scandal headlines or whispered gossip. It had simply been two people caught unexpectedly in the same quiet space while snow erased the outside world. Yet standing here now beneath the chandeliers, Nathan felt the echo of that night return with sudden clarity, like footsteps in a hallway he had not realized he was still walking through. Across the ballroom, Aisha slowly lifted her head, perhaps sensing the weight of someone watching her. Their eyes met for the first time since that storm. She did not smile. She did not look frightened. Instead, she held his gaze with the same calm steadiness he remembered from the mornings in his penthouse kitchen, one hand resting gently over the life growing beneath her dress. Around them, the gala continued without pause, glasses clinking, investors laughing, cameras flashing near the stage where the next speaker prepared to announce a breakthrough in artificial intelligence. But in that single quiet moment, the distance between a tech millionaire and the maid who worked in his home seemed to collapse into something far more complicated than anyone in that ballroom could possibly imagine. And Nathan Cole realized with a clarity that felt both heavy and undeniable that whatever decision he made next would not remain hidden in the quiet corners of his penthouse for long, because some truths, once seen, have a way of stepping directly into the brightest lights in the room. Aisha Brooks did not look away first. The music from the quartet drifted through the ballroom like slow-moving water, and the quiet murmur of wealthy conversation wrapped around the moment as if nothing unusual had happened at all. Yet Nathan Cole felt the air shift in a way he could not explain. For a man who had built an empire by analyzing patterns and predicting outcomes, uncertainty was something he rarely tolerated. Yet the sight of Aisha standing across the room with that calm, steady posture made his carefully ordered mind stumble. 6 months ago, she had been the quiet woman who arrived at his penthouse at 7:30 in the morning sharp, letting herself in with the building pass, moving through the rooms while the early sunlight stretched across the polished floorboards. Now she stood beneath chandeliers that reflected 1,000 points of light, and the simple curve beneath her dress carried a question that could not be solved with data or strategy. Nathan excused himself from the investors beside him with a polite nod and stepped away from the cluster of voices and glassware. Each step across the ballroom felt strangely loud in his ears, even though the room itself remained filled with conversation. He was used to walking through crowds with confidence, used to reporters angling for comments and entrepreneurs hoping to shake his hand. Yet tonight he moved quietly, almost cautiously, as if approaching a fragile truth that might disappear if he moved too quickly. Aisha noticed him coming long before he reached her. Her shoulders remained relaxed and her expression did not change, but the way she straightened slightly told him she understood the gravity of the moment just as clearly as he did. When he stopped a few feet away, the difference between their worlds seemed suddenly visible in the smallest details. His tailored jacket, the simple dress she wore, the diamond lights of the gala reflecting in the glass wall behind her, while the city stretched far below like a river of headlights. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt deeper than the music, deeper even than the city beyond the windows. Finally Nathan drew a slow breath and spoke her name. Aisha. Her reply was calm and steady. Good evening, Mr. Cole. The familiarity of the greeting made the moment feel even stranger, like hearing the echo of a normal morning conversation inside a room full of cameras and billion-dollar ambition. Nathan glanced briefly toward the crowd behind him, instinctively measuring who might be watching, then returned his attention to her. I did not expect to see you here tonight. A faint hint of warmth touched her eyes, but she did not smile. I understand that, sir. I did not expect to be here either. The honesty of the answer caught him slightly off guard. How did you get an invitation to this event? Aisha lowered her gaze briefly before answering, not in embarrassment, but in thought. My cousin works in the catering staff. One of the guests canceled their reservation this afternoon, and the event coordinator allowed her to offer the seat to a family member. She said I should come see what a room like this looks like at least once. Nathan followed her glance across the ballroom, where waiters in white jackets moved between tables carrying silver trays. The explanation made sense, and yet it did not ease the tension building inside him. His eyes drifted again to the gentle curve beneath her dress. When did this happen? The words left his mouth quietly, but the weight behind them was unmistakable. Aisha rested one hand lightly over her stomach, the same gesture he had seen from across the room earlier. Almost 5 months ago. The timeline landed with precise clarity in Nathan's mind. 5 months. Snow falling outside the glass walls of his penthouse. The quiet warmth of the kitchen lights reflecting off marble counters. He felt the memory unfold with uncomfortable precision. Aisha continued before he could ask the question forming in his thoughts. I was not planning to tell you tonight. Nathan studied her face, searching for any sign of accusation or anger, but he found none. Her composure remained steady, the same quiet dignity she carried every morning while cleaning rooms that cost more than most homes in America. Why did you not say anything earlier? She lifted her gaze to meet his directly. Because I did not want your life to become complicated because of me. The answer was simple, but it struck him harder than he expected. Complicated. That word alone described the fragile architecture of his public reputation, the investors, the press coverage, the endless scrutiny that followed every major figure in the technology industry. A story involving the founder of Coal Dynamics and a maid from his own building would travel through media outlets like wildfire. Nathan exhaled slowly and glanced again toward the center of the ballroom, where a group of photographers had begun gathering near the stage. You understand what this could turn into. If people find out. Aisha nodded once. I understand very well. Then why come here tonight? The question sounded sharper than he intended, but she did not react to the tone. Because I refuse to hide my life out of fear, she answered quietly. Her voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath the words now, the quiet strength he had noticed from the beginning. I came here to see something different from the small apartment where I live and the bus routes I ride every morning. I did not come here to create a scandal. Nathan looked at her for a long moment, absorbing the simplicity of the statement. Around them the gala continued in polished perfection, laughter rising from tables, investors trading predictions about the next billion-dollar company. But the space between Nathan and Aisha felt like a private world carved out in the middle of the room. Finally, he asked the question that had been building since the moment he first saw her across the ballroom. Is it mine? Aisha did not hesitate. Yes. The single word settled into the air between them with quiet certainty. Nathan felt something shift deep inside his chest. Not panic exactly, but a profound awareness that the careful structure of his future had just changed direction. He had spent years building companies, managing risk, predicting outcomes through algorithms and analysis. Yet nothing in his experience prepared him for the reality standing calmly in front of him beneath the chandeliers of a Manhattan gala. Aisha did not move closer, and she did not step away. She simply stood there with the same steady presence she carried every morning in his penthouse kitchen. Whatever decision Nathan Cole made next would ripple far beyond the polished walls of the ballroom. But in that quiet moment neither of them spoke again, because some truths do not need to be explained immediately. Sometimes they simply stand in front of you and wait for the future to arrive. A quiet truth, once spoken, does not disappear simply because the room around it continues smiling. Nathan Cole stood motionless for a moment after Aisha's answer, the single word yes echoing through his mind with more weight than the applause rising near the stage where another entrepreneur had just finished presenting a new artificial intelligence platform. Around them the gala remained bright and polished, the kind of event where success was measured in valuations and partnerships. Yet Nathan felt as if he had stepped outside the rhythm of the room entirely. For years his life had followed a precise structure. Meetings began at exact times. Data produced predictable models. Risks were calculated before decisions were made. Yet nothing in that structure prepared him for the quiet certainty standing a few feet away from him now. A woman who cleaned the marble counters in his kitchen every Tuesday morning and who carried within her a future he had never planned to face. Aisha watched him carefully but without pressure, her posture relaxed despite the gravity of what had just been said. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded anything. She simply stood there beneath the soft golden light with one hand resting over her stomach as if the moment belonged to the natural order of the world rather than a disruption of it. Nathan finally spoke again, his voice lower than before. Does anyone else know? Aisha shook her head gently. No one who matters to your world. My family knows. My doctor knows. But I have not spoken about you to anyone. Nathan studied her face, trying to detect hesitation or hidden expectation. But again he found only the calm steadiness that had always defined her presence in his home. That storm night returned to his thoughts once more with unusual clarity. The snow had covered Manhattan so completely that the city lights looked muted and distant through the glass walls of his penthouse. The heating system hummed softly while wind brushed against the windows like a slow-moving tide. They had spoken for hours that night about simple things that rarely appeared in his daily life. She told him about her mother who worked long hours at a hospital in Baltimore, and about the small backyard where she used to sit during summer evenings listening to the sound of passing trains. Nathan had shared stories about the early days of his company when he slept on a couch beside computer servers that ran day and night. There had been no ambition in those conversations, no attempt to impress. Only the quiet honesty that comes when two people find themselves unexpectedly outside their usual worlds. The memory made his chest tighten slightly now. A sudden burst of laughter rose from a nearby table, pulling him briefly back to the present. A group of investors had begun discussing a major acquisition rumored to happen before the end of the quarter. Their voices carried the confident rhythm of people accustomed to controlling outcomes. Nathan understood that rhythm well. It had shaped most of his adult life. Yet the quiet moment with Aisha felt entirely different, as if the future had stepped into the room without asking permission from the systems he had built. "What are you planning to do?" he asked carefully. Aisha answered without hesitation. "I am planning to continue living my life." The simplicity of the response made Nathan raise an eyebrow slightly. "You say that as if nothing has changed." "Something has changed," she replied calmly, resting her hand more firmly over her stomach. "But the change belongs to me first." Nathan absorbed the words slowly. There was no accusation in them, only clarity. The distinction mattered more than he expected. Many people in his position would assume that a revelation like this would immediately lead to negotiations, financial agreements, complicated discussions about reputation and responsibility. Yet Aisha spoke as if the decision about her future had already been made long before this conversation. He glanced again toward the center of the ballroom where the stage lights were being adjusted for the next presentation. Photographers moved like quiet shadows between tables, capturing images of success and celebration. One photograph taken from the right angle could easily include both of them standing together near the glass wall. Nathan felt the weight of that possibility immediately. "We should not remain standing here like this," he said quietly. "Too many people with cameras tonight." Aisha nodded once, understanding the implication without needing further explanation. They moved slowly toward a quieter corner near a long corridor that led toward the private conference rooms used earlier in the evening. The lighting there was softer and the crowd thinner, giving them a small island of privacy within the larger event. Nathan rested one hand lightly against the polished wood railing beside the corridor and looked out through the glass wall where traffic moved along Fifth Avenue like streams of red and white lights. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then he spoke again, his tone thoughtful rather than defensive. "You said you did not want to complicate my life. That is considerate, but the reality may not remain simple. For long. Stories move quickly in this city." Aisha followed his gaze toward the distant streets before answering. "I am aware of that. I have lived in this city long enough to know that quiet moments rarely stay quiet forever." Nathan turned slightly to face her again. "Then why tell me tonight? You could have continued your plan without involving me yet." Aisha considered the question before replying. "Because you deserve to hear the truth from me before hearing it from someone else." The sincerity in her voice carried a weight that Nathan could not ignore. It reminded him of something he often told young entrepreneurs during mentorship programs, that honesty delivered early is worth more than perfect explanations delivered too late. The realization made him almost smile despite the seriousness of the moment. Aisha continued speaking before the silence stretched too long. "I am not asking you for anything tonight. I only wanted you to know the truth before the world decides to create its own version of it." Nathan nodded slowly, appreciating the logic even as the implications continued unfolding in his mind. Somewhere across the ballroom, a bell chimed softly announcing the beginning of the next presentation. Guests began drifting back toward the stage while servers refreshed glasses and cleared empty plates. The gala returned to its confident rhythm, but Nathan remained beside the glass wall with Aisha, aware that the life he had carefully organized around predictable outcomes had just expanded into territory where no algorithm could guide him. He looked at her once more, not as the maid who moved quietly through his penthouse each morning, but as a woman whose calm dignity had introduced an entirely new chapter into his future. And though he had not yet spoken the decision forming slowly in his mind, he understood with unusual clarity that the path ahead would require something he had rarely needed before. The courage to face a truth that could not be solved like a problem, but only lived. The soft chime announcing the next presentation faded into the background as Nathan Cole remained beside the glass wall overlooking Fifth Avenue. The reflection of the city lights stretching across the polished floor like a quiet river of silver and gold. Aisha Brooks stood only a few feet away, calm and composed, her posture steady despite the enormous truth now resting between them. From a distance, nothing about the scene appeared unusual. Two guests speaking quietly near the corridor while the rest of the ballroom returned its attention to the stage. Yet inside Nathan's mind the evening had already shifted into something entirely different from the carefully planned celebration it was supposed to be. He had built companies worth billions of dollars by trusting logic, data, and careful timing. Problems were meant to be solved with strategy. Futures were meant to be calculated with precision. But the future now forming around him did not behave like any equation he had ever studied. The glow of the city beyond the glass seemed almost unreal, as if Manhattan itself were pausing to watch what decision he would make next. Nathan folded his arms loosely across his chest, not out of defense, but out of thought. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet weight of a man thinking through consequences that extended far beyond the present moment. When were you planning to stop working at my apartment? Aisha answered gently. At the end of this month. The response surprised him slightly. Why that soon? Because it will become difficult to keep pretending nothing has changed, she said calmly. I do not believe in secrets that grow larger every week. Nathan nodded slowly, appreciating the honesty even though it made the situation more real. The quiet strength in her voice reminded him again of the storm night months earlier. That night the city had disappeared behind curtains of snow while the apartment remained warm and silent above Central Park. There had been something unexpectedly peaceful about that isolation from the outside world. For a few hours the constant noise of success, competition, and expectation had faded into the background. Nathan remembered standing near the same glass wall with a cup of tea while Aisha spoke about the small details of her life that most people never asked about. She told him about the public library where she spent afternoons reading when she first moved to New York, about the early morning buses she rode through Brooklyn before the sun fully rose, about the quiet pride she felt sending part of every paycheck home to help her younger brother continue college. The memories returned now with unusual clarity. Nathan looked at her again and asked quietly, "Do you regret that night?" The question was not accusatory. It was sincere. Aisha did not hesitate. No. The certainty in her answer was calm and grounded. It was an honest night. Nathan absorbed the words slowly. The simplicity of her response carried more dignity than he expected. She did not treat the memory like a mistake or a secret that needed to be erased. Instead, she spoke of it as something that simply belonged to the past and had led naturally to the present. Around them, the gala continued its polished performance. The speaker on stage had begun describing a new satellite communication network that promised to expand internet access across remote regions of the world. Applause rose and fell as investors reacted to projected numbers displayed on a large screen. Nathan barely noticed. His focus remained on the quiet conversation unfolding beside the glass wall. If this becomes public, he said thoughtfully, reporters will not treat it with the same calm you have shown tonight. Aisha nodded once. I know how stories travel in this city. Nathan studied her expression carefully. You still came here anyway. Yes, she replied softly. Because I refuse to shape my life around the fear of what strangers might say. The statement hung in the air for a moment. Simple, yet deeply grounded. Nathan realized that the quiet confidence in her words was something he had rarely encountered in the circles he normally moved through. Many powerful people spoke with authority, but few carried the kind of steady dignity that did not depend on wealth or status. Aisha continued before he could respond. I understand that your world is different from mine. I understand that your name appears in business magazines and news reports. But this child does not belong to headlines. This child belongs to life. Nathan looked down briefly at the floor, the reflection of the chandeliers shimmering across the marble tiles. The phrase she had used echoed in his mind. Belongs to life. For a moment, he imagined the future through the lens of his usual strategic thinking. Lawyers, contracts, agreements, quiet financial arrangements designed to keep personal matters away from the public eye. It would be easy to handle the situation that way. Many men in his position would do exactly that. Yet something about Aisha's presence made those solutions feel strangely hollow. She had not come to him asking for protection or money. She had simply told him the truth, and allowed him to decide who he wanted to be in response to it. The realization unsettled him more than he expected. In the distance, a group of photographers moved closer to the stage where a well-known venture capitalist had just arrived. Camera flashes began to sparkle like tiny bursts of lightning across the ballroom. Nathan glanced briefly toward the activity before returning his attention to Aisha. "Your cousin is working here tonight," he said. "Yes," she answered. "In the catering staff." Nathan nodded thoughtfully. "That means you will probably remain for the rest of the event." She smiled faintly for the first time since the conversation began. "I promised her I would not disappear before dessert." The small moment of humor softened the tension slightly. Nathan allowed himself a brief smile in return before the seriousness of the situation settled back in. He took a slow breath and looked once more at the endless lights of Manhattan beyond the glass wall. The city had always represented opportunity to him, a place where ambition could build towers out of ideas and persistence. Tonight it looked different somehow. Larger, more uncertain, filled with possibilities that could not be predicted by financial models or software code. Finally, Nathan turned back to Aisha and spoke with a quiet clarity that surprised even him. "I will not pretend this conversation never happened." Aisha met his gaze without fear. "I would not expect you to." Nathan continued carefully. "Tomorrow morning I will speak with my legal team and my advisors. Not because I want to hide this truth, but because I need to understand how to protect everyone involved from unnecessary chaos." Aisha listened without interruption. When he finished, she nodded gently. "That is your world, Mr. Cole." Nathan shook his head slightly. "Tonight it is our world." The correction hung between them for a moment before the distant applause of the gala rolled across the ballroom once more. Somewhere beyond the lights and the music, a future was quietly forming. And for the first time in many years, Nathan Cole understood that the most important decisions of his life would not be made in boardrooms or conference calls, but in moments exactly like this one, standing beside a quiet woman who refused to let fear decide the shape of tomorrow. The applause from the stage rolled across the ballroom once again, echoing beneath the tall ceiling like distant thunder, yet Nathan Cole barely heard it. The conversation with Aisha Brooks had shifted something inside him that could not simply be pushed aside by returning to business talk and polite smiles. For years he had moved through rooms like this with complete confidence, accustomed to the quiet authority that came from building a technology empire from nothing more than lines of code and long nights in a rented warehouse. Investors respected him. Journalists analyzed his decisions. Competitors studied his strategies. Everything about his public identity had been constructed carefully, piece by piece, like the architecture of a powerful machine. Yet now, standing near the glass wall overlooking Fifth Avenue, he realized that the most important decision he had faced in years had nothing to do with software, markets, or corporate expansion. It had to do with the quiet woman standing beside him who refused to shape her life around fear. Aisha remained calm, her posture steady despite the growing attention drifting toward the stage where another influential figure had just arrived. The ballroom lights shimmered across polished floors, and the distant skyline reflected against the tall windows like a painting made of electric stars. Nathan studied her for a moment longer before speaking again, his tone thoughtful rather than guarded. "After tonight, I think it would be better if we spoke somewhere quieter." Aisha nodded gently. "I expected that." He glanced toward the center of the room, where photographers were now gathering around a well-known investor who had just entered the gala. The flashes from their cameras lit the air in brief bursts. The last thing Nathan wanted was to become part of that spectacle while this conversation remained unfinished. He turned back to her. "I will have my driver take you home when the event ends." Aisha tilted her head slightly. Mr. Cole, I came here with my cousin. She will worry if I disappear. Nathan considered this before answering. Then let me at least arrange a car for both of you. It is late, and Manhattan traffic after events like this can take hours. Aisha paused for a moment, then nodded. Thank you. The exchange was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried a quiet respect that had been growing between them since the beginning of the conversation. Nathan folded his hands loosely in front of him as he looked again through the glass wall toward the endless motion of the city. Cars moved along the avenues like streams of light, while distant buildings glowed with offices that remained active long after sunset. He had always loved this view. It reminded him of possibility. Tonight it reminded him of responsibility. After a few seconds he spoke again, his voice calm but firm. Tomorrow morning I will meet with my advisors as I said earlier. But that conversation will not define what happens next. Aisha looked at him carefully. What will define it then? Nathan turned toward her fully now, the decision forming more clearly with each passing moment. Truth will define it. The answer seemed to surprise her slightly, though she did not show it dramatically. You speak about truth as if it is simple. Nathan shook his head lightly. It is not simple at all, but hiding from it would only create a larger problem later. Aisha studied him for a moment before responding. Many men in your position would choose silence instead. Nathan allowed a faint smile to appear. Many men in my position are terrified of losing control. The honesty of the remark seemed to ease the tension between them slightly. Across the ballroom, a soft melody began playing as the musicians prepared for the dinner portion of the gala. Guests started drifting toward the tables arranged in elegant rows beneath the chandeliers. Waiters moved quietly between them with trays of sparkling water and wine glasses catching the light like small mirrors. Nathan watched the movement thoughtfully. The world around him continued exactly as it had before, unaware that his personal life had shifted into unfamiliar territory. Aisha followed his gaze briefly before speaking again. You should probably return to your guests. This is your event tonight. Nathan exhaled slowly. It was supposed to be. Then he looked at her again. But some moments changed the direction of an entire evening. Aisha rested her hand gently over her stomach again, a gesture that had already become natural to her. The child had begun to move occasionally in recent weeks, a quiet reminder that time was passing whether anyone was ready for it or not. She did not mention this to Nathan yet, but the thought crossed her mind as she watched him carefully considering every word he spoke. There was something different about him now compared to the man she first met months earlier while cleaning his apartment. That man had been confident, focused, surrounded by the quiet energy of constant ambition. The man standing beside her tonight seemed more reflective, as if he were discovering a part of himself that had been waiting quietly beneath years of success. Nathan glanced toward the stage once more as a master of ceremonies stepped forward to introduce the next segment of the evening. Applause followed the announcement. Investors and founders took their seats while servers began delivering carefully arranged plates to each table. Nathan looked back at Aisha. Would you be comfortable staying here for dinner with the other guests? She smiled faintly at the unexpected question. I am not sure the organizers would be comfortable with that. Nathan raised an eyebrow. If anyone asks, you are my guest. Aisha studied his expression for a moment to determine whether he was joking. He was not. You would do that tonight? She asked quietly, in front of everyone. Nathan did not hesitate. Yes. The simplicity of his answer carried a quiet certainty that surprised even him. For years he had been careful about every public appearance, every photograph, every interview that could shape how the world viewed him. Tonight that careful control suddenly seemed less important than the honesty he had promised only minutes earlier. Aisha looked toward the tables where guests were beginning to settle into their seats. Then she looked back at Nathan. If I sit with you tonight, people will talk. Nathan nodded. People always talk. The difference is whether the story they tell begins with truth or speculation. The musicians shifted into a slower melody as the room gradually quieted for dinner. Nathan extended a hand in a simple, respectful gesture. Aisha Brooks, would you join me at the table? For a moment, she simply looked at him, measuring the sincerity behind the invitation. Then she accepted his hand with calm dignity. Yes, Mr. Cole. I will join you. Together they stepped away from the glass wall and moved toward the center of the ballroom, where the long tables waited beneath golden light. Around them conversations continued and laughter drifted through the air, but something fundamental had changed in the quiet space between them. For the first time since the evening began, Nathan Cole was no longer thinking about headlines or investors or corporate strategy. Instead, he was thinking about the future that had quietly entered his life and the unexpected strength of the woman walking beside him toward it. The golden light above the dinner table softened as the musicians shifted into a slow instrumental melody, and the entire ballroom settled into a quieter rhythm. Conversations lowered to polite tones while servers moved gracefully between the rows of guests, placing carefully arranged plates in front of executives, founders, and investors who had spent the evening discussing the future of technology and innovation. Yet for Nathan Cole, the most significant development of the night was not happening on the stage or in the conversations about artificial intelligence and billion-dollar startups. It was happening quietly beside him as he walked with Aisha Brooks toward the central table reserved for the evening's primary guests. Their pace was calm and steady, but the distance between the glass wall and the table felt longer than the width of the ballroom. A few nearby guests glanced toward them with curiosity, noticing Nathan returning with a woman who had not been standing among the usual circle of investors earlier in the evening. In rooms like this, small details rarely went unnoticed. Nathan was well aware of that reality, yet his posture remained relaxed, his expression composed, the same quiet confidence that had carried him through countless negotiations and public appearances. Aisha walked beside him with the same dignity she had shown throughout the night. She did not rush, and she did not shrink away from the attention that occasionally drifted toward them. Instead, she carried herself with calm presence, her shoulders straight and her gaze forward, as though she belonged in the room just as naturally as anyone seated at the tables. When they reached the main table near the stage, several prominent guests were already seated. A well-known venture capitalist from Silicon Valley looked up first, offering Nathan a friendly nod before his eyes shifted briefly toward Aisha with mild curiosity. Nathan returned the greeting and gently pulled out a chair. "Please, sit here." Aisha paused only a moment before taking the seat. Her movement was smooth and composed, and when she settled into the chair, she rested her hands lightly in her lap. Nathan took the seat beside her just as a waiter approached with 2 glasses of sparkling water. Around the table conversations resumed, but Nathan could feel the subtle shift in attention from several people who recognized him well enough to notice when something unexpected happened. One executive leaned slightly closer and spoke quietly. "Nathan, I do not believe we have met your guest." Nathan glanced briefly at Aisha before answering with calm clarity. "This is Aisha Brooks. She is joining me for dinner this evening." The introduction was simple and deliberate. Aisha inclined her head politely. "Good evening." The executive returned the greeting with professional courtesy, though the curiosity in his expression remained. In a room where most introductions included titles, companies, and investment portfolios, the absence of those details made the moment stand out in a quiet way. Nathan reached for his glass of water, taking a slow sip as he listened to the conversation around the table gradually shift toward the upcoming keynote presentation scheduled after dinner. Investors discussed emerging markets while analysts predicted which technology sectors would dominate the next decade. Yet beneath the polished surface of those discussions, Nathan remained aware of the presence beside him. Aisha did not interrupt the conversations or attempt to draw attention to herself. Instead, she observed the room quietly, occasionally glancing toward the stage where large screens displayed images of satellite networks and digital infrastructure. The world represented in those presentations was far removed from the daily routine she knew, yet she watched with thoughtful interest rather than intimidation. After a few minutes, the venture capitalist across the table leaned forward again, curiosity finally overcoming polite restraint. "Nathan, forgive the question, but how did the two of you meet?" The table grew slightly quieter, the kind of subtle pause that often occurs when people sense a story behind a simple question. Nathan did not hesitate. "Aisha works in the building where I live." The response was honest without revealing unnecessary detail, yet it was enough to draw a few raised eyebrows from those familiar with the exclusivity of his residential tower overlooking Central Park. Aisha remained composed, her calm expression unchanged as she lifted her glass of water. She did not attempt to add to the explanation or correct it. The quiet dignity in her silence spoke clearly enough. Dinner plates arrived moments later, arranged with the careful precision expected at an event of this scale. Soft candlelight reflected across polished silverware, while the musicians continued their gentle melody near the stage. For a while the table returned to discussions about investment strategies and emerging technologies. Nathan participated in the conversation when necessary, offering brief insights that carried the same thoughtful authority people expected from him. Yet part of his attention remained focused on the quiet presence beside him. At one point he leaned slightly closer to Aisha and spoke in a low voice meant only for her. "Are you comfortable?" She nodded gently. "I am. Thank you for asking." Nathan studied her expression for a moment before returning his attention to the table. The evening continued with the polished elegance typical of high-profile gatherings. Yet the subtle awareness surrounding their presence never fully disappeared. Several guests observed them discreetly, their curiosity lingering like a quiet question waiting for context. Aisha seemed to understand this without needing it explained. She had lived long enough in New York to recognize the language of curious glances and polite restraint. What surprised Nathan most was how naturally she navigated the environment. She did not appear overwhelmed by the wealth surrounding her, nor did she attempt to imitate it. She simply existed within the moment, grounded in her own sense of self. As dessert plates were served and the stage lights brightened for the evening's final keynote speaker, Nathan found himself reflecting on the unusual direction the night had taken. Only a few hours earlier he had expected nothing more than speeches about innovation and conversations about market expansion. Instead, he now sat beside a woman whose quiet strength had shifted the focus of his entire future. When the speaker finally stepped onto the stage and the room quieted for the presentation, Nathan glanced once more toward Aisha. She was watching the stage thoughtfully, one hand resting gently over the life growing within her. In that moment, he understood something that no financial forecast could have predicted. The most important investment of his life would not appear on any balance sheet or technology report. It was already sitting beside him beneath the warm lights of a Manhattan ballroom, quietly reminding him that the direction of a life can change not through ambition alone, but through the courage to face unexpected truth with honesty. The final keynote presentation drew the full attention of the ballroom, and the large screens beside the stage glowed with images of satellites orbiting the Earth, their digital paths crossing oceans and continents like bright threads connecting distant cities. The speaker's voice carried clearly through the hall as he described the future of global communication, but Nathan Cole found that only part of his attention remained on the presentation. The rest of his thoughts moved quietly toward the woman sitting beside him and the future that had revealed itself in the middle of what was supposed to be a predictable evening. Aisha Brooks sat calmly with her hands resting lightly together on the table, her posture relaxed despite the subtle attention that still surrounded their presence. From time to time a guest at another table would glance toward Nathan, recognizing him easily, then allow their eyes to drift briefly toward Aisha with polite curiosity. The room had not forgotten that she had arrived with him unexpectedly. Yet no one had asked further questions. In places like this, people often preferred quiet speculation over direct conversation. The speaker finished his remarks to strong applause, and as the lights brightened slightly, guests began rising from their chairs to stretch, refill their glasses, and exchange impressions about the presentation. The atmosphere shifted from focused attention back into lively discussion. Nathan leaned slightly toward Aisha, speaking in a calm voice that remained private despite the growing movement around them. "Are you ready to leave soon?" Aisha nodded gently. "Yes. It has been a long evening." Nathan agreed. "I will arrange the car now." He stood from the table and stepped aside, taking out his phone to send a quick message to his driver waiting near the building entrance. The reply came within seconds, confirming that the car would be ready when they exited the ballroom. When Nathan returned to the table, he noticed two of his colleagues approaching from across the room, both senior partners in a venture capital firm that had invested in several of his early projects. Their expressions were friendly but observant, the look of people accustomed to reading situations carefully. One of them extended his hand. "Nathan, excellent keynote tonight. The satellite proposal was impressive." Nathan shook his hand politely. It certainly raised interesting possibilities. The second colleague glanced toward Aisha with a courteous smile. I do not believe we have had the pleasure of meeting your companion. Nathan responded calmly. This is Aisha Brooks. She is joining me this evening. Aisha offered a respectful nod. Good evening. The two men greeted her politely, though Nathan could sense their curiosity beneath the surface. After a brief exchange about business developments and upcoming conferences, the colleagues excused themselves and returned to their own group. As they walked away, Aisha spoke quietly. Your world observes everything very carefully. Nathan allowed a faint smile. That is because many people here believe information is power. She considered this for a moment before replying. Sometimes silence is also power. Nathan glanced at her with thoughtful interest. You may be right about that. Around them, the ballroom had begun transitioning toward the final portion of the evening. Some guests were gathering near the stage for photographs, while others prepared to leave early for private meetings or late flights out of the city. Waiters cleared the dessert plates and replaced them with small cups of coffee and tea. The musicians had paused, allowing the low hum of conversation to fill the room once more. Nathan checked his phone again and nodded slightly. The car is waiting downstairs. Aisha stood slowly from her chair. Thank you for arranging that. Nathan gestured toward the main corridor leading out of the ballroom. They began walking together through the softly lit hall, passing clusters of guests engaged in quiet conversations. A few people greeted Nathan along the way, and he responded with brief polite exchanges while continuing toward the exit. Aisha moved beside him with steady composure, neither rushing nor hesitating as they crossed the room. When they reached the wide marble hallway outside the ballroom, the noise of the event softened into a distant echo behind them. Tall windows along the corridor revealed the night skyline stretching far beyond the city blocks, and the air felt cooler away from the crowded hall. Aisha paused for a moment near one of the windows, looking out across the glowing streets below. Manhattan looked almost peaceful from this height, its endless motion reduced to streams of tiny lights flowing between buildings. Nathan stopped beside her. The view is different when you see it from above, he said quietly. Aisha nodded. Yes. From down on the street, everything feels faster. Up here it almost feels still. Nathan looked at the city thoughtfully. When I first moved here, I used to stand by my apartment window at night and watch the traffic for hours. It reminded me that every light represented someone chasing a future. Aisha smiled faintly. That is a hopeful way to see it. Nathan glanced toward her. And how do you see it? She rested one hand gently over her stomach before answering. I see a city where every light belongs to a story. Some of those stories are loud and visible. Others remain quiet for a long time before anyone notices them. Nathan considered the words carefully. The elevator doors at the end of the hallway opened with a soft chime. A uniformed attendant greeted them politely and held the doors as they stepped inside. The quiet hum of the elevator began as it descended toward the lobby. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The reflection of the overhead lights shimmered across the mirrored walls, creating the sense of a moment suspended between floors and decisions. Finally, Nathan broke the silence. Tomorrow will bring many questions. Aisha nodded calmly. I know. Are you worried? She shook her head gently. No. I have lived most of my life answering questions. What matters is whether the answers come from honesty. Nathan watched the floor numbers change slowly on the panel beside the door. Honesty is not always the easiest path. Aisha replied softly, but it is usually the clearest one. The elevator reached the lobby, and the doors opened to reveal the polished marble entrance of the building. A few late guests from the gala were passing through the reception area, while the doorman held the front doors open to the cool night air outside. Nathan stepped forward and gestured toward the exit, where a black car waited beneath the lights of the entrance canopy. The driver immediately opened the rear door as they approached. Aisha paused for a moment before getting inside, looking once more toward the towering building behind them, where the gala continued high above the street. Nathan joined her in the car, and as the door closed softly behind them, the quiet interior of the vehicle created a small world separate from the city outside. The car began moving slowly through the late evening traffic of Manhattan, and as the lights of Fifth Avenue passed by the windows, Nathan realized that the evening, which had begun as another routine event in his professional life, had quietly become the beginning of a story that would change far more than he had ever expected. The black car moved steadily through the late-night streets of Manhattan. The glow of traffic lights sliding across the windows in quiet flashes of red, yellow, and green. Inside the car, the air felt calm and insulated from the restless energy of the city outside. Nathan Cole sat on one side of the back seat while Aisha Brooks sat beside him, both of them watching the passing streets in thoughtful silence. The driver navigated through the avenues with the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to New York traffic, weaving carefully between taxis and delivery vans that still moved through the city even at this hour. For a few minutes, neither Nathan nor Aisha spoke. The events of the evening had been significant enough that words felt unnecessary at first. Sometimes silence allowed important moments to settle more naturally than conversation. Nathan rested his arm lightly against the door and looked out toward the rows of buildings sliding past the car window. Each building held hundreds of apartments, each apartment its own quiet world of stories, decisions, and hopes. Earlier that evening, he had been surrounded by investors discussing technology that could reshape the future of communication across continents. Yet the most important future he now faced was seated quietly beside him in the dim light of the car. Aisha eventually spoke first, her voice calm and reflective. It is strange how the city looks different at night when you are not rushing somewhere. Nathan turned his head slightly toward her. In what way? She glanced out at the sidewalks where a few late pedestrians moved beneath the streetlights. During the day, everything feels fast. People hurry past each other and do not notice the small details. At night, the city feels slower, almost thoughtful. Nathan considered that observation. I used to work through the night when I first started my company. The city felt different then too. He smiled faintly at the memory. Most of the buildings were dark except for the offices where people were still chasing their ideas. Aisha looked at him with quiet curiosity. Did you ever imagine that your company would become as large as it is now? Nathan shook his head slowly. Not in the beginning. In those early days, success meant paying the rent on a small office and keeping the servers running. The larger vision only became clear after many years. Aisha nodded thoughtfully, absorbing the reflection. The car slowed slightly as it turned onto a quieter avenue lined with tall trees whose leaves rustled gently in the night breeze. Nathan noticed the subtle change in the rhythm of the ride and realized they were approaching the neighborhood where Aisha lived. The buildings here were older, built decades earlier when the city expanded northward with brick apartment houses and narrow storefronts. The streets were calmer than the busy avenues of Midtown, with only a few lights glowing in the windows above. Nathan glanced toward her again. Which building is yours? Aisha gestured gently toward a corner a few blocks ahead. The one near the small grocery store with the blue sign. The car continued forward until the driver slowed beside the building she had indicated. The storefront below was dark, but a faint street lamp illuminated the entrance steps leading up to the apartments above. The driver parked along the curb and turned slightly in his seat. We have arrived. Nathan nodded and reached for the door handle before stepping out into the cool night air. Aisha followed a moment later, the quiet sound of the car door closing behind her echoing softly along the nearly empty street. The city felt peaceful here compared to the bright energy of the gala they had just left behind. Nathan looked up briefly at the building, noticing the simple brick exterior and the narrow windows that reflected the pale glow of the streetlight. Aisha stood beside him, adjusting the strap of the small purse she carried. Thank you for bringing me home, she said gently. Nathan nodded. It was the least I could do. For a moment, they both looked toward the entrance of the building, aware that the evening was reaching its natural end. Yet the conversation that had begun at the gala still lingered between them, unfinished in many ways. Nathan spoke again, his tone thoughtful. Tomorrow will likely bring many new questions for both of us. Aisha met his gaze calmly. I understand that. Are you ready for what comes next? She rested one hand lightly over her stomach again before answering. I have been preparing myself for months. Nathan studied her expression carefully. There was no fear there, only the quiet confidence he had noticed from the beginning. The strength in her calm presence reminded him again of the decision forming steadily in his mind since the moment she told him the truth. I would like to meet again tomorrow, he said after a moment. Somewhere quiet where we can speak without interruption. Aisha considered this before responding. That would be wise. Nathan nodded. I will send you the location in the morning. She agreed with a gentle nod. That sounds good. A cool breeze moved softly through the street, carrying the distant sounds of traffic from a larger avenue several blocks away. The quiet moment between them felt both simple and significant at the same time. Nathan realized that the world he had built over many years of ambition and discipline was beginning to expand into something far more personal than he had ever expected. Aisha reached for the door handle leading into the building, but paused before opening it. "Mr. Cole," she said softly. Nathan looked at her. "Thank you for listening tonight." The sincerity in her voice carried a quiet warmth that surprised him. He responded with equal honesty. "Thank you for telling the truth." Aisha opened the door and stepped into the softly lit hallway inside the building. Before the door closed, she glanced back once more toward the street where Nathan still stood beside the waiting car. Then she disappeared up the staircase toward her apartment. Nathan remained outside for a moment longer, looking at the building thoughtfully while the city continued its slow midnight rhythm around him. Finally, he returned to the car and closed the door behind him. As the driver guided the vehicle back onto the street and into the flowing lines of Manhattan traffic, Nathan understood that the evening had marked the beginning of a chapter in his life that no boardroom meeting or technology conference could have predicted, and that the decisions he would make in the coming days would shape not only his own future, but the future of the quiet life that had already begun to grow within Aisha Brooks. The car carrying Nathan Cole moved smoothly through the quiet avenues of Manhattan, the city lights reflecting across the windshield like distant constellations drifting slowly past. Inside the vehicle, the silence felt heavier than before, not uncomfortable but thoughtful, as if the night itself understood that something important had begun to unfold. Nathan leaned slightly back in the leather seat while the driver guided the car toward Midtown, where his penthouse tower stood among the tallest buildings in the city. Outside the window, the familiar skyline appeared different tonight. The towering glass structures that once symbolized nothing but ambition now seemed to hold thousands of private lives within their glowing windows. Each light represented a family, a conversation, a quiet decision shaping a future. Nathan had spent years building a company that connected millions of people through technology, yet he suddenly realized that the most meaningful connection of his life had arrived without strategy or design. The car slowed as it approached Central Park, where the dark stretch of trees created a quiet shadow against the surrounding lights of the city. Nathan looked out across the park for a moment before speaking quietly to the driver. "Please take the long route around the park before heading home." The driver nodded respectfully and turned onto a wider avenue that curved gently along the park's edge. Nathan needed the extra time to think. Earlier that evening, he had stood in a ballroom full of investors discussing the future of satellite communication. Only hours later, he was now facing a reality that no financial projection could have predicted. A child. The word itself felt unfamiliar inside his thoughts. Nathan had never imagined himself in that role. His life had always revolved around building something larger than himself through technology, not through family. Yet the calm certainty in Aisha's voice when she said yes echoed clearly in his memory. She had not spoken with anger or expectation. She had simply told the truth and allowed him to respond in his own time. That quiet dignity had left a deeper impression on him than any dramatic confrontation could have. The car continued along the edge of Central Park where the dark trees rustled softly in the night breeze. Nathan watched the city move slowly past the window and considered the possibilities ahead. His advisors would certainly urge caution. Public image, corporate stability, shareholder confidence. Those concerns would be raised immediately once the situation became known. Yet something inside him resisted the idea of reducing the truth to a problem that required legal containment. Aisha had trusted him with honesty. The least he could do was respond with the same clarity. By the time the car finally turned toward his building on the Upper East Side, Nathan had already begun shaping a decision, though he knew the full consequences would only become clear with time. The vehicle stopped beneath the private entrance canopy where a doorman stood waiting beneath soft golden lights. Nathan stepped out and thanked the driver before entering the building lobby. The quiet marble hall felt almost empty at this late hour, with only a night receptionist seated behind the desk and a security guard monitoring the elevator cameras. Nathan greeted them politely and stepped into the elevator that would carry him up more than 70 floors to his penthouse. As the elevator rose smoothly through the tower, he watched the floor numbers change on the digital panel. The city lights beyond the glass walls of the elevator shaft shimmered with every passing floor. When the doors finally opened onto the private hallway leading to his apartment, the silence felt complete. Nathan unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar space greeted him with the calm order he had always preferred. The living room stretched across the far wall of glass overlooking Central Park. The grand piano stood exactly where it always had, and the marble kitchen counters gleamed beneath the soft overhead lighting. Everything appeared unchanged from the previous morning when Aisha had last worked there, yet the atmosphere felt subtly different now. Nathan removed his jacket and placed it carefully over the back of a chair before walking toward the window. The park below looked like a dark ocean surrounded by the bright shoreline of city lights. He rested one hand against the glass and allowed himself a moment to breathe deeply. For years this view had represented control and accomplishment. Tonight it represented responsibility. His phone vibrated softly in his pocket, breaking the silence. Nathan looked at the screen and saw a message from his assistant reminding him about a strategy meeting scheduled for the following morning. He typed a brief reply asking her to move the meeting 2 hours later and to arrange a private conference room at a quiet cafe downtown. When he finished sending the message, he placed the phone on the counter and poured himself a glass of water. The cool taste helped clear his thoughts. Tomorrow he would meet Aisha again, this time in a place far removed from the cameras and speculation of the gala. They would speak openly about what came next, not as employer and employee, not as strangers connected by circumstance, but as two people facing the same unexpected future. Nathan returned to the window and looked once more at the sleeping city below. Somewhere across Manhattan, Aisha Brooks was likely resting in her small apartment after the long evening. The life growing within her would continue quietly through the night, unaware of the conversations and decisions forming around it. Nathan realized that the future he had always imagined for himself was beginning to expand into something more personal than he had ever planned. Yet instead of fear, he felt an unusual sense of clarity. The truth had already arrived. Now the only question that remained was how he would choose to stand beside it when the world eventually began asking its own questions. Morning arrived slowly over Manhattan, the pale light of early dawn spreading across the skyline as the city prepared to wake once again. From the 72nd floor of his building, Nathan Cole stood near the wide glass wall of his penthouse watching the first signs of movement below. Delivery trucks rolled along the avenues while joggers moved quietly along the paths of Central Park. The world outside appeared calm and predictable, yet Nathan knew that the direction of his own life had shifted during the previous evening in a way that no business forecast could have prepared him for. He had slept only a few hours, not because he felt anxious, but because his mind had been working through possibilities with the careful focus that had always defined his approach to difficult decisions. The quiet honesty in Aisha Brooks's voice remained clear in his memory, and the simple truth she had trusted him with continued to shape the thoughts forming inside his mind. By the time the sun finally began rising above the distant buildings, Nathan had already made two important arrangements. The first was with his assistant, who had reserved a quiet private corner at a small cafe downtown, where conversations could remain away from the attention of reporters and business partners. The second arrangement was with his legal advisor, whom he had asked to remain available later in the day, without yet explaining the reason. Nathan believed in preparation, but he also believed in speaking with Aisha directly before allowing the situation to become defined by legal language or corporate strategy. After dressing for the day in a simple dark suit, he stepped into the elevator that carried him down through the building toward the street. The lobby was already alive with the quiet movement of early commuters beginning their routines. Nathan greeted the doorman and stepped outside into the cool morning air where his driver waited beside the familiar black car. As the vehicle moved through the avenues toward the cafe, Nathan watched the city awaken around him. Coffee shops were opening their doors while office workers hurried toward subway entrances. The rhythm of the city felt steady and purposeful, a reminder that life continued moving forward regardless of the private decisions people carried with them. Across the city, in a smaller brick apartment building, Aisha Brooks was also beginning her morning. Sunlight filtered gently through the thin curtains of her bedroom window, while the distant sounds of traffic drifted upward from the street below. She had slept better than Nathan expected she might after the long evening. But when she woke, she remained still for a few minutes with one hand resting over her stomach. The quiet movement of the child within her had become a familiar comfort during recent weeks. It reminded her that the future she carried was real, not simply an idea or a fear, but a life already growing day by day. Aisha rose slowly and prepared for the morning with calm focus. She dressed in a simple blue dress and made a small cup of tea in her kitchen while the morning news played quietly on a small television in the corner. The reporters spoke about financial markets and international technology conferences, completely unaware that one of the city's most prominent entrepreneurs was preparing to face a personal truth that would soon change the direction of many conversations. When Aisha finished her tea, she checked her phone and saw the message from Nathan that had arrived earlier that morning. The address of the cafe appeared along with a simple note saying he would meet her there at 10 o'clock. Aisha read the message twice before placing the phone back in her purse. She felt no hesitation about the meeting. The previous evening had already confirmed something important about Nathan Cole. Beneath his public reputation and disciplined success, there was a man capable of listening with sincerity. That quality mattered more to her than wealth or status. By the time the clock approached 10 o'clock, both of them had arrived at the small cafe located on a quiet street in Lower Manhattan. The place was known for its calm atmosphere and large windows that allowed soft morning light to fill the room. Nathan arrived first and selected a table near the back where the conversations of other customers blended gently with the sound of coffee machines and soft music. When Aisha entered a few minutes later, he stood to greet her with a respectful nod. "Thank you for coming." Aisha returned the greeting calmly before taking the seat across from him. "Thank you for inviting me." For a moment, they simply looked at one another across the table, aware that the quiet conversation about to unfold carried the weight of decisions that would shape the future for both of them. A waiter approached and placed 2 cups of coffee on the table before leaving them alone again. Nathan folded his hands lightly together and spoke with thoughtful clarity. "I spent most of the night thinking about everything you told me." Aisha listened without interrupting. Nathan continued calmly. "I also considered what the easiest path would be for someone in my position. Many advisors would recommend creating distance from the situation and resolving it quietly through financial arrangements." Aisha nodded slightly. "That is what I expected you might say." Nathan shook his head gently. "But that is not the path I have chosen." Aisha studied his expression carefully. "What path have you chosen then?" Nathan met her gaze directly. "The path of responsibility." The words settled between them with quiet significance as the soft sounds of the cafe continued around them. Outside the window, the city moved through its normal morning routine, unaware that inside the small cafe, 2 people were beginning a conversation that would soon change the course of many lives. The quiet hum of the cafe continued around them, while sunlight filtered through the tall windows and reflected softly across the wooden table. Nathan Cole's words still rested in the air between them, calm and deliberate. "The path of responsibility." Aisha Brooks studied his face carefully, searching not for confidence or wealth, but for sincerity. She had heard promises before in her life, some spoken with charm and others with hesitation, yet the tone in Nathan's voice felt different. It was not dramatic and it did not seek approval. It sounded like a decision already made during the quiet hours of the night. For a moment, neither of them spoke as the waiter passed by carrying fresh coffee to another table. Outside the window, pedestrians moved along the sidewalk with the purposeful rhythm of a New York morning. Nathan rested his hands lightly around his coffee cup and continued speaking with thoughtful calm. "I understand that this situation involves more than just the 2 of us. There is a child who will one day grow up and ask questions about where they came from and who stood beside them at the beginning." Aisha nodded slowly. "That is something I have thought about every day since I found out I was pregnant." Nathan leaned forward slightly. "I do not want that child to grow up hearing stories that are incomplete or hidden behind legal agreements. I want the truth to be something we stand behind openly." The honesty of his statement seemed to settle gently into the quiet space of the cafe. Aisha looked down at her hands for a moment before lifting her eyes again. "Many people in your position would choose a simpler path." Nathan allowed a faint smile to appear. "The simpler path often becomes the most complicated one later." Aisha studied him carefully. "And what exactly does responsibility look like to you?" Nathan did not answer immediately. He took a slow breath as if choosing each word with care. "Responsibility means acknowledging that the life growing inside you is part of my life as well. It means being present, not only financially but personally. It means creating a future where that child understands that they were never hidden or treated as an inconvenience. The sincerity of the explanation carried a quiet strength that surprised Aisha. She had prepared herself for many possible outcomes before coming to the cafe. She had imagined polite distance, careful legal language, perhaps even attempts to negotiate silence. What she had not expected was a conversation centered on honesty and presence. Nathan continued speaking. I also understand that you have your own life and independence. I do not want to take that away from you by suddenly placing you inside a world that may not feel natural to you. Aisha tilted her head slightly. You are referring to your world of investors and corporate headlines. Nathan nodded. That world can be loud and intrusive. Reporters often search for stories that create attention rather than understanding. If this news becomes public, it will attract curiosity from people who do not know either of us. Aisha considered this thoughtfully. That possibility has already crossed my mind many times. Nathan looked at her carefully. Does that worry you? She answered calmly. I am not afraid of curiosity. I am only concerned about protecting the child from unnecessary confusion. Nathan nodded slowly. That is something we both want. The conversation paused briefly as the waiter returned to refill their coffee cups. The small interruption allowed both of them a moment to reflect on the seriousness of what had just been discussed. When the waiter left, Nathan continued speaking in a more practical tone. I have spoken with my legal advisor this morning only to prepare for possible public questions. But I made it clear that no action will be taken without our agreement together. Aisha appreciated the respect behind that statement. Thank you for including me in the process. Nathan leaned back slightly in his chair. This situation belongs to both of us. Decisions should reflect that. Outside the cafe, a city bus rolled past the window, its bright advertisement catching the sunlight for a moment before disappearing down the street. The movement reminded Aisha of the everyday life that continued around them. Despite the importance of their conversation, the rest of the world remained unaware that anything unusual was happening at this quiet table. Aisha rested her hand lightly over her stomach again, a gesture that had become instinctive in recent weeks. Nathan noticed the movement and spoke gently. Have you been feeling well? She nodded. The doctor says everything is healthy. Nathan felt a quiet relief at that answer. I would like to attend the next appointment if you are comfortable with that. Aisha looked at him with mild surprise. You would want to be there. Nathan answered simply. Yes. If we are going to walk this path together, then I should understand each step. The sincerity in his voice removed any doubt about his intention. Aisha allowed herself a small smile. I think that would be good. Nathan returned the smile briefly before becoming thoughtful again. There is another question we should consider. Aisha looked at him attentively. What question is that? Nathan spoke carefully. Where do you see your life during the next year? Aisha did not rush to answer. She looked toward the window where the sunlight had grown brighter as the morning continued. For most of her life, she had built her future step by step through practical decisions. She had moved to New York to support her family. She had worked long hours to create stability for herself. Now a new life was growing within her, changing the direction of those plans. After a few moments, she replied quietly. I see myself raising this child with honesty and dignity. Everything else can adapt around that purpose. Nathan listened carefully before nodding with understanding. Then we share the same goal. Aisha studied his expression one more time, measuring the depth of the commitment he had just expressed. The man sitting across from her was known to the world as a technology visionary and business strategist. Yet in this quiet moment, he appeared simply as a person choosing to stand beside the truth rather than avoid it. The decision carried weight far beyond the small cafe where they sat. It meant that the path ahead would require patience, courage, and cooperation between two people whose lives had once moved in completely different directions. Outside the window, the morning sunlight continued spreading across the streets of Manhattan, illuminating the city with the promise of another busy day. Inside the cafe, Nathan Cole and Aisha Brooks sat together in calm conversation, quietly beginning the next chapter of a story that neither of them had planned, but both were now willing to face with honesty. The quiet atmosphere of the cafe remained steady as the morning progressed, yet something had shifted between Nathan Cole and Aisha Brooks since the moment he spoke about responsibility. Their conversation had moved beyond uncertainty and into a space where decisions began to take shape with quiet clarity. The sunlight through the large windows had grown brighter now, casting long reflections across the wooden floor and the polished surface of the table. Outside, the sidewalks of Lower Manhattan were filling with office workers, cyclists, and delivery drivers moving through their daily routines, unaware that inside the small cafe, a conversation was unfolding that would soon ripple far beyond its quiet walls. Nathan leaned slightly back in his chair, his fingers loosely wrapped around the warm coffee cup as he continued speaking with the calm precision that had always defined his way of thinking. "There is another part of this situation that we should address early," he said thoughtfully. Aisha listened carefully. "What part is that?" Nathan glanced briefly toward the window before answering. "Public attention." Aisha nodded slowly. "I suspected that would come eventually." Nathan continued with a measured tone. "When news about personal matters involving someone in my position becomes visible, reporters tend to search for details quickly. Some stories are written with respect. Others are written simply to attract attention." Aisha remained composed as she absorbed his explanation. "I have seen enough news headlines to understand that." Nathan studied her expression carefully. If the story becomes public without preparation, it could create confusion or speculation that neither of us deserves. Aisha rested her hand gently over her stomach again before replying. "Then preparation seems wise." Nathan appreciated the directness of her response. "Exactly. I believe the best approach is honesty presented clearly before rumors begin shaping the narrative for us." Aisha tilted her head slightly. "You are suggesting we speak openly about the situation?" Nathan nodded once. "Yes. Not through dramatic announcements or interviews designed to attract attention, but through a calm statement that explains the truth in simple terms." Aisha considered the idea quietly for several moments. The concept of public attention did not frighten her, but she understood that it would bring a level of scrutiny she had never experienced before. Eventually she spoke again. "If the truth becomes public, it will also connect my name to your world permanently." Nathan did not hesitate. "That connection already exists whether the world knows it or not. The difference is whether it becomes known through honesty or through speculation." Aisha looked down briefly at the coffee cup in front of her before meeting his eyes again. "I do not want the child to grow up discovering their story through headlines written by strangers." Nathan nodded firmly. "Neither do I." The shared understanding between them strengthened the quiet foundation that had begun forming during their conversation. Nathan continued explaining his thoughts with careful clarity. "Later today, I will meet briefly with my communications advisor. Not to create a dramatic story, but simply to prepare a clear statement in case questions appear. The message will be simple. That we are expecting a child, and that we are committed to raising that child with responsibility and respect." Aisha listened thoughtfully before responding. "And what will happen when people begin asking about our relationship?" Nathan allowed a small smile to appear. "The honest answer is that our relationship is evolving." Aisha returned a faint smile. "That is certainly true." Nathan leaned slightly forward again. "What matters most is that the child grows up knowing both parents chose honesty instead of secrecy." Aisha nodded quietly. "That is the kind of beginning I would want for any life." The conversation paused briefly as a group of customers entered the cafe and took seats near the front. The soft clatter of cups and the gentle sound of conversation blended into the background once again. Nathan glanced at his watch before looking back at Aisha. "There is one more decision I would like to make together." Aisha looked at him with calm curiosity. "What decision is that?" Nathan spoke carefully. "Where you would like to live during the coming months." Aisha seemed slightly surprised by the question. "I had planned to remain in my apartment for now." Nathan nodded respectfully. "That is certainly your choice. But I want you to know that if you ever feel more comfortable staying somewhere quieter or closer to medical care, I will make those arrangements immediately." Aisha studied his expression before answering. "You are offering this out of concern, not control." Nathan responded calmly. "Exactly." Aisha appreciated the clarity in his tone. "Thank you for making that distinction." Nathan glanced again toward the window where sunlight now illuminated the street completely. "I also want to ask something else." Aisha waited attentively. Nathan spoke gently. "When the time comes for the child to be born, I would like to be there." The request was simple, yet it carried deep meaning. Aisha's eyes softened slightly as she considered the sincerity behind the words. "That would be appropriate," she replied quietly. Nathan nodded with quiet relief. "Good. The conversation between them had now moved through many of the questions that might have remained uncertain only a few hours earlier. Instead of tension, there was a growing sense of partnership forming around the shared responsibility they had both acknowledged. Outside the cafe, the city continued its steady rhythm as the morning advanced toward midday. Inside, the two of them sat across from one another with calm understanding that their lives were beginning to intersect in ways neither of them had originally planned. Nathan eventually stood from his chair and placed a few bills on the table to cover the coffee. "Shall we take a walk before you return home?" Aisha agreed with a gentle nod. "That sounds nice." They stepped outside together into the bright Manhattan morning, where the city air carried the energy of thousands of people moving toward their own futures. As they began walking along the quiet street side by side, Nathan realized that the most important decision he had made was not simply acknowledging the child, but choosing to face the future beside the woman who had trusted him with the truth. The morning sunlight followed them as they walked slowly along the quiet street outside the cafe, the warm light reflecting from the windows of nearby buildings and settling gently across the sidewalks of Lower Manhattan. The city was now fully awake, filled with the steady movement of people heading toward offices, construction sites, shops, and subway entrances. For most of them, the day felt ordinary, another step in their personal routines. Yet for Nathan Cole and Aisha Brooks, the morning carried the quiet significance of a turning point. Their conversation had moved through uncertainty and into something far more meaningful, a shared understanding that the future ahead would not be shaped by fear or avoidance, but by deliberate honesty. Nathan walked beside Aisha with an easy pace, his hands resting loosely in his coat pockets as they followed the sidewalk toward a small park located just a few blocks away. The trees inside the park had begun showing early signs of seasonal change, their leaves glowing softly in shades of green and gold under the late morning sun. A few parents pushed strollers along the paved path, while older residents sat quietly on benches reading newspapers or simply enjoying the calm air. The scene felt peaceful, almost symbolic of the life they had just been discussing. Aisha noticed the strollers first and slowed her steps slightly as they approached the park entrance. Nathan saw the small shift in her movement and followed her gaze toward a young couple sitting on a bench with their infant wrapped in a blanket. The child made a soft sound that caused both parents to laugh quietly. Nathan studied the moment with thoughtful attention. "Life often begins in the simplest settings," he said quietly. Aisha nodded gently. "It does not require wealth or recognition. It only requires care." Nathan looked toward her with quiet agreement. "That is something I have learned more clearly during the last 24 hours than in many years before." They continued walking along the path beneath the trees, the sounds of the city softening slightly as the park surrounded them with calm. Nathan spoke again after a few moments of silence. "When I built my company, I believed success meant creating systems that connected millions of people through technology. Now I realize there are connections that matter far more deeply than digital networks." Aisha smiled faintly at the reflection. "Some of the most important connections in life happen quietly when no one is paying attention." Nathan nodded slowly. "That seems to be exactly what happened to us." Aisha stopped briefly near a bench facing a small fountain where sunlight sparkled across the water. She turned toward him with thoughtful calm. "Do you ever regret that night when the snowstorm kept us inside your apartment?" Nathan did not hesitate. "No." He looked toward the water for a moment before continuing. "That night was honest. Nothing about it was planned or forced. It was simply two people sharing time without the expectations that usually surround my life." Aisha seemed satisfied with that answer. "Good. Because I have never regretted it either." The honesty between them had become natural now, free from the tension that often accompanies difficult conversations. Nathan rested one hand against the back of the bench as he looked across the small park where children were beginning to play near a fountain statue. For most of his adult life, he had focused on creating technology that predicted human behavior through data analysis and algorithms. Yet standing here in the quiet sunlight, he understood something that no algorithm could measure. Life rarely followed predictable formulas. Sometimes it arrived through unexpected moments that demanded courage rather than calculation. Aisha sat gently on the bench for a moment, adjusting her purse beside her while the breeze moved softly through the trees above. Nathan joined her, and for a few minutes they simply watched the peaceful scene around them. Eventually, Aisha spoke again. When the child is old enough to ask about this time, what will you tell them? Nathan looked thoughtful for a moment before answering. I will tell them the truth. That their parents met in an unexpected way but chose to stand beside that truth instead of hiding from it. Aisha nodded with quiet satisfaction. That is the kind of story a child deserves to hear. Nathan glanced toward her and added softly, and I will tell them that their mother had more courage than anyone else in the room when she decided to speak honestly about the future. Aisha looked slightly surprised by the compliment, but smiled gently. Courage sometimes appears when there is no other path left to take. Nathan shook his head slightly. In my experience, many people choose the easier path, even when it avoids truth. You chose differently. The sunlight moved slowly across the park as the morning continued. After a few minutes, Nathan stood and offered his hand to help Aisha rise from the bench. They began walking again along the path toward the street where the sounds of traffic gradually returned. When they reached the edge of the park, Nathan paused and looked toward the tall buildings surrounding the city skyline. The world beyond those streets would soon begin asking questions. Investors, reporters, colleagues, and strangers would form opinions about the story unfolding between them. Yet standing there beside Aisha, he felt an unusual calm. The most important decision had already been made when he chose honesty instead of distance. Aisha noticed the thoughtful expression on his face. What are you thinking about now? Nathan answered quietly. I am thinking that the future rarely arrives the way we expect it. Sometimes it arrives in the form of responsibility that becomes the most meaningful opportunity of our lives. Aisha considered the words before nodding slowly. Then perhaps this unexpected path will lead somewhere better than either of us planned. Nathan smiled with quiet certainty. I believe it already has. Together, they stepped back onto the busy Manhattan sidewalk where the energy of the city continued flowing in every direction. People hurried past them, taxis moved through intersections, and the skyline stood tall above the streets as it had for generations. Yet among the millions of stories unfolding in the city that day, one story had quietly begun to grow stronger than the rest. It was the story of a powerful man learning that true leadership includes responsibility beyond business success, and of a quiet woman whose dignity had reshaped the future not through demand or pressure, but through the simple courage of telling the truth. And as Nathan Cole and Aisha Brooks walked side by side into the bright afternoon, the life they had chosen to protect together was already becoming the most important chapter either of them would ever write.